See this gap? It's one of President Joe Biden's first obstacles toward re-election. Up here is how the economy performed up until the end of last year by two key metrics. Both GDP and employment are above average, but down here, almost 2 deviations below that average, is how voters feel about it. This line shows the Consumer Sentiment Index, a national survey out of the University of Michigan.
Consumer sentiment has been a little bit of a mystery. We actually saw a historic low in the Michigan survey. It was even worse than it was during the Great Recession.
And that matters for Biden, because if you look at consumer sentiment when an incumbent has run for re-election, you'll see that when people are feeling good about the economy, incumbents have typically won. But when people feel worse, they've lost. And when people are in the middle, well, we'll get to that. Just know that ahead of the 2024 election, experts are watching this point and whether this gap between the economy and how people feel about it might shrink. Unlike consumers, many economists are feeling pretty good about the economy.
This is one of the most well-balanced economies we've seen in a long time.
The GDP, which measures the total value of goods and services produced, is growing. For 2023 as a whole, it rose over $1 trillion. When adjusted for inflation, that's a 2.5% increase, which is right in the middle of the targeted 2 to 3% for GDP.
GDP is really the clearest story, which is we've had steady growth, there hasn't been a recession for several years. Things have been moderate but steady.
And a growing GDP is usually a good sign for employment, which we're seeing with today's strong labor market. If we look at the unemployment rate and zoom into the most recent data, you see that it has sat below 4% for the last 2 years, the longest stretch in decades. By this metric, almost everyone who wants a job has one. But unemployment rate and GDP aren't necessarily predictors of how people feel about the economy.
People don't eat the GDP number. They eat the food they buy at the grocery store.
And that food has gotten more expensive. This chart is what the Federal Reserve uses to gauge inflation, known as the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, or PCE. Anytime the line is above here, inflation is higher than the Federal Reserve wants it. And for all of 2022, inflation was above that targeted line. But which prices rose is more important.
Certain types of prices are loud metrics. They matter a lot more when we're talking about how they influence people's feelings and thoughts about the economy.
Namely, food and energy. Look at this inflation line with food and energy included, versus inflation without those categories. In June of 2022, the index with food and energy was almost 2 percentage points higher than the index without those categories. This led consumers to spend over 11% of their disposable income on food, the highest percent in over 30 years. And food prices are what economists refer to as sticky, which means once they go up, they're unlikely to come down.
There's this notion of familiarity with prices. Even I find myself referring back to prices which I was more familiar with when I was younger. I mean, I bought a soda for 25 cents, and that's not an option anymore. And so you get these reference points when it comes to prices, and it takes a long time to move off of that.
So even though this inflation measure began trending down almost 2 years ago, consumers might still be feeling its effects.
People care more about the level of prices than the fact that they're rising more slowly than before.
And according to a Wall Street Journal poll, 74% of voters feel that their household income hasn't kept up with inflation.
That's a very daunting number for the president.
So how has income fared? Let's look at real income, which includes wages as well as other sources like capital gains, and is adjusted for inflation over time. Anytime the line dips below this one here, income is not keeping up with the cost of living. And what you see with this dip is that for most of 2022, average income changes didn't offset rising costs. The good news today is that with inflation mostly coming down, that has now flipped. Income adjusted for inflation has been rising above the cost of living. It may take a while for consumers to adjust to price expectations for food, and it's not clear if that will happen fast enough to help Biden, especially since voters are also struggling with the price of housing. When consumers were asked whether they think it's a good time to buy a home, the majority said no. In fact, the number of consumers that think it's a good time to buy a home is the lowest since 1982.
So maybe people are saying, I'm unhappy with the overall economy, but what they really mean to say is, I'm just really frustrated by how expensive housing is.
And looking at the prices of homes, it's clear they rose significantly during the pandemic.
Housing prices are sensitive to a whole host of things. Population changes, to interest rates, but ultimately what probably drives housing prices as much as anything is the demand for housing relative to the supply of housing. And right now we know the supply of housing is really, really weak.
But even that may not explain the gap between the economy and how voters feel. Now, many Americans say they feel sour about the economy because of their long-term financial security. And some report feeling fragile and vulnerable to wide-ranging social and political threats, something experts call referred pain.
There's war in Europe. There's war in the Middle East. COVID threw everybody for a loop, and inflation was unpredictable. And amid all of this, we have a presidential campaign with two leaders that many people find uninspiring. It's the sense that this country that used to be able to put a man on the moon can't tie its shoelaces anymore.
But the good news for Biden is that while sentiment around the economy is still low, it's starting to trend upward, seen most clearly in the beginning of this year. And that could be a big deal. Remember this chart? For most of these years when consumer sentiment was near a cyclical peak, these moments, the incumbent won. But in 2012, that pattern ended and a new one emerged. Obama won re-election before that peak in sentiment, but the trend was moving upward. And when Trump lost his re-election, sentiment had posted declines prior to the vote. Experts say this trend upward is a good sign for an incumbent, even if that is yet to show up in Biden's polling numbers.
Joe Biden has very low marks. The question becomes, will opinions of Joe Biden's handling of the economy continue to improve, and will that lift him in his re-election campaign?
And because the 2024 election is a rematch of two presidents, there's more than just economics at play. Both candidates have track records voters can point to.
The more people feel better about the economy, the more their attention starts turning to other things.
So even if feelings toward the economy improve, Biden and Trump will still need to convince voters that they're the best option for a variety of reasons.